At Blenheim's palace, on a 1977 winter afternoon, a 86-year-old woman walks through the empty corridors where her laughs echoed as a crystal breaking. Her bare feet touch the cold marble, and she moves like a ghost in her own home, a house that has not belonged to her for decades. The curtains have been closed for years. Natural light became enemy. Gladys Marie Deacon for a dusty Venetian mirror, religious from times when her beauty was described by newspapers like the eighth wonder of the world. Now she lifts her hands on her face, hands that have already held the rarest jewels in Europe, which has caressed the faces of princes and writers. But today they try to hide something different, something that the paraffin injected into its cheeks decades earlier has transformed into a grotesque mask of its ancient perfection. The mirror reflects not only a face, but an entire age that faded. And in this morbid silence of Blenheim, where the whispers of the English aristocracy still echo among the stones, a question remains suspended in the air like golden dust. What happens when beauty, this cruel currency of femininity, becomes his own prison? If you are fascinated by these stories of splendor and decay, where luxury always hides a deeper shadow, consider subscribing to the channel. Here we unveil the secrets that the palaces preferred to forget, and the lives that shone so intensely that only ashes left. Gladys Marie Deacon was born on February 7, 1881 in Paris, daughter of Edward Parker Deacon and Florence Baldwin, two names that carried both prestige and curse. Edward was an American heir of naval fortune, a man whose emotional instability manifested himself in explosions of jealousy and violence. Florence belonged to the high society of Boston, a woman of refined beauty who had married too young with a man who would prove her tormentor. Gladys's childhood was golden brown only on the surface. The family lived between Paris and the French Riviera, attending Belle Epoque's most exclusive halls, where the Deacon were received with the very rich reverence. But within ornate mansions, a sinister tension grew like mold on marble walls. Gladys was only 10 years old when he witnessed the event that would forever define his relationship with love, beauty, and destruction. In 1892, his father found that Florence had an affair with Émile Abel, a young Frenchman. The discovery was not silent. Edward Parker Deacon waited for his lover in a Cannes hotel and murdered him with cold blood, 3 shots in his chest, while Gladys was playing in the neighboring property garden. The following trial has become the scandal of the year in Europe. The newspapers disputed every sordid detail: the blood in the Persian carpet, the love letters found in the room, Florence's despair when discovering the corpse. Edward was acquitted. The male code of honor still protected betrayed husbands, but the Deacon family was socially dead. In this moment of public devastation, something extraordinary happened with Gladys. While his mother Florence dived into deep depression and imprisonment, the girl began to develop an almost mystical obsession with beauty, as it was intended that in a world that had destroyed his family by passion, only physical appearance could offer him protection and power. At the age of 15 in 1896, Gladys was already considered one of the most beautiful young women in Europe. But beauty, for her, was not a gift. It was a project. He spent hours before the mirror, studying every angle of his face, every movement of his lips, every slope of his neck. She had understood something her contemporaries still ignored. The appearance was performance, and performance was power. His education took place in the best Swiss and French colleges, but true learning took place in Parisian halls where Florence, recovered from the scandal, tried to rebuild the family's social position. Gladys watched how men bowed before certain women, how conversations stopped when certain figures entered the halls. She studied the secret codes of aristocratic seduction as a general studies war maps. At 18, Gladys had become more than beautiful. She was magnetic. His appearance combined classic features with something wild and unpredictable. The blue eyes had a disturbing intensity, as if to see through the people. Bay hair was always arranged in hairstyles that suggested both elegance and intimate disorder. But it was his posture that truly mesmerized. Gladys moved as if he knew that all eyes were on her, and as if it were, simultaneously, his greatest pleasure and his greatest curse. The first to completely succumb was the Duke of Marlborough, Charles Spencer Churchill, 9th Duke of one of England's most powerful strains frog. He first saw her in 1897 during a ball in London and would later say it was like being hit by a golden radius. Gladys was 16. He, 46, married to Consuelo Vanderbilt in an arranged marriage that united American fortune with the English nobility. What started as flirting became obsession. Marlborough sent him daily letters, rare jewelry, invitations to secret meetings on rural properties. Gladys accepted everything with the naturalness of those who always knew that this was his destiny. But there was something cruel in her seduction. She always kept the Duke on the border between hope and despair, granting her just enough to keep him captive. For years, Gladys reigned as the non-official lover of one of England's most powerful men. She attended Blenheim Palace as if she were already the owner, wearing the jewelry of the Churchill family at public events, received deference from servants and courtiers. It was a dangerous game, but she dominated her rules like no one else. In 1903, at the age of 22, Gladys made a decision that revealed both her genius and self-destruction. She decided that her natural beauty was not enough. Paris was seething with aesthetic surgery experiments, and she had heard of a revolutionary procedure that promised to eternalize youth. Dr. Charles Conrad, a German doctor who attended the European elite at his discreet clinic in the 8th arrondissement, offered paraffin injections to sculpt his female face. The procedure was simple. Liquid paraffin was injected into cheeks, lips, chin, creating volume and eliminating any sign of aging. The patients left the clinic with more defined, more dramatic, more perfect faces. Gladys submitted to the procedure with the same determination with which others face battles. She wanted not only to preserve her beauty, but to intensify her. If her face was her weapon, she would make him even more lethal. The initial results were spectacular. His cheeks gained a sculptural definition. His lips became fuller. His appearance has acquired an almost supernatural quality. In the halls of Paris and London, it was whispered that Gladys Deacon had discovered the secret of eternal youth. Photographers disputed sessions with her. Painters begged to portray her. She had become not only beautiful, but a work of living art. The Duke of Marlborough became even more obsessed. But there were other admirers. Auguste Rodin, who described her as the only woman who truly understands sculpture. Marcel Proust, who used her as inspiration for several characters in Search of Lost Time. Giovanni Boldini, who painted his most sensual portraits, capturing not only his appearance, but something predatory in his eyes. Gladys had understood that he had become something beyond the human. It was now an idea, a symbol, a materialized fantasy. And for some golden years, this was enough for him. In 1906, at the age of 25, Gladys finally reached his supreme goal. Consuelo Vanderbilt, Duchess of Marlborough, had tired of public scandals and private humiliations. She accepted divorce, a scandal in itself in Edwardian society, and left Blenheim Palace taking a fortune in compensation and the satisfaction of having escaped a marriage that had always been a commercial transaction. Charles Spencer Churchill was free. And Gladys Deacon, after almost a decade as his semi-official lover, could finally claim the title he had always considered his right, Duchess of Marlborough. The marriage was celebrated in June 1921 at the St. Louis and Invalid Church in Paris. Gladys, at the age of 40, wore a Worth dress that had cost more than a mansion, borrowed jewelry from the French crown, and a veil of Belgian lace that had belonged to Maria Antonietta. She was at the height of her artificial beauty. The paraffin had settled perfectly on her face, creating a mask of aristocratic perfection. The ceremony was described by the newspapers as the marriage of the century, but there was something funeral at the event. Perhaps it was the age of the bride and groom, he at the age of 70, she at 40. Perhaps it was the public knowledge that that love had destroyed a previous marriage and had scandalized two nations. Or maybe it was something darker, the feeling that Gladys, finally winning his title, had also sealed his destiny. Blenheim Palace received her as her new lady, but the servants whispered that the new Duchess had something strange. She spent hours locked in her rooms, always in front of mirrors. He received Parisians in secret, and more disturbing, it was beginning to show signs of a personality that oscillated between manic euphoria and deep depression. In the early years of marriage, Gladys tried to play his ducal role with the same determination he had applied to seduction. She redecorated Blenheim with dear French, organized 3-day balls, received the European royalty with a luxury that impressed even the most used to excess. But under the performance, something rotted. The first sign that something was wrong appeared in 1925. During a formal dinner in Blenheim, a guest noted that the Duchess's face seemed slightly asymmetrical. One of the cheeks was higher than the other, as if the meat had moved at night. Gladys ran to the mirrors and confirmed his worst nightmare. The paraffin was migrating. What no doctor had completely explained was that the paraffin, with time and gravity, does not remain static on the face. It moves slowly through the tissues, creating unpredictable deformations. In some women, the process took decades. In Gladys, for reasons that may be related to the excessive amount injected or the quality of the material, it began after just 20 years. At first, the changes were subtle, a morning swelling that took longer to disappear, an asymmetry that only she noticed. But gradually, month after month, his face began to turn into something that was no longer human. The paraffin formed hard nodules under the skin. He created strange protrusions on the cheeks. He distorted his lips, which became grotesquely swollen and deformed. Her eyes, once hypnotic, began to disappear amid swelling. The face that had been his supreme glory became his supreme curse. Gladys sought the best doctors in Europe, surgeons in Paris, Vienna, London. All gave the same diagnosis: irreversible. The paraffin had so integrated into facial tissues that removing it would mean completely destroying its appearance. She was stuck in a mask of her own creation. The Duke of Marlborough, who obsessed her for almost 30 years, began to show disgust. I could no longer look straight at her during meals, avoided appearing with her in public. Private, he referred to her as the creature living upstairs. From 1928, Gladys rarely left his quarters in Blenheim. She had turned her rooms into a kind of sanctuary of lost vanity, lined with mirrors on every angle, where she spent hours studying the progression of her deformity with the same scientific obsession that once applied to the improvement of her beauty. Their only companies were the cats, dozens of them, Persians of pure race that had imported from French breeders. They circulated freely through the ducal rooms, slept in silk beds, ate in porcelain dishes. Gladys talked to them in French, English, and Italian, long conversations about the cruelty of time, the betrayal of the flesh, the loneliness of lost perfection. The servants began to call her the Duchess of Cats. Some whispered that she had completely driven away. Others, more godly, suggested that she simply found a way of dealing with the tragedy of her appearance. But the truth was more complex. Gladys was consciously arching its own legend. She knew she had become a monster, but decided to be a magnificent monster. During the 1930s, while Europe was preparing for another war, Gladys developed a routine that would follow for the next 4 decades. Woke up at noon. He spent 3 hours before the mirrors, applying layers of makeup that tried to mask paraffin deformations. He dressed in the same couture dresses he had worn on his glory days, now adapted to accommodate an aged body and an unrecognizable face. At 6 in the afternoon, he roamed the corridors of Blenheim as an elegant ghost, visiting the halls where he had once reigned as the most beautiful woman in Europe. He stopped before his own portraits, dozens of them painted by famous artists in their golden years, and contemplated the distance between what had become. At midnight, he looked up at his quarters and wrote letters to dead friends, memories that would never send to editors, poems about beauty as a hereditary curse. His previously impeccable handwriting became increasingly irregular, as if his hands trembled with the weight of all the truths he could never confess. In 1934, the Duke of Marlborough died of pneumonia, leaving Gladys widowed at 53. She did not attend the funeral. When questioned by the newspapers, he sent a laconic statement. Private grief. The truth was that I couldn't stand the idea of being photographed. The widowhood brought him a bitter freedom. As a Duchess widow, she had the right to stay in Blenheim for the rest of her life. But she had also inherited astronomical debts. Charles had spent almost all the family fortune maintaining the lifestyle Gladys required. The palace needed urgent reforms. The taxes were late. The creditors accumulated me. But Gladys showed no interest in the financial situation. His only obsession was the war that waged against the mirrors. She began to cover all Blenheim's mirrors with dark cloths. Then he ordered them to be completely removed. Then it prohibited any reflective surface in the rooms it used. Silver trays were replaced by wooden dishes. Windows were covered with heavy curtains. Even metal door handles were replaced by matte porcelain versions. But the obsession didn't stop there. Gladys hired artists to paint their current portraits, not to show, but to destroy. She burned them in private ceremonies in the garden of Blenheim, whispering Latin words he had learned in French convents during the youth, as if he could, through fire, purify his image of the curse she had created herself. The cats have multiplied. In 1940, there were more than 50 felines living in Blenheim. They slept in ducal beds, ate remains of banquets that Gladys organized only for them, used real diamond collars. The palace began to permanently smell the feline urine and French perfume, a combination that the few visitors described as the odor of aristocratic decay. World War II brought drastic changes to Blenheim Palace. The British government requested parts of the palace to house soldiers and refugees. Gladys, now 60, was confined to a smaller and smaller wing of the property that had one day completely controlled. She watched the invasion of her privacy with dignity that impressed to her detractors. City soldiers slept in rooms where she had received kings. London evacuated children played in the gardens where he had once been Marcel Proust. Military nurses used their private halls as makeshift wards, but Gladys remained inmate in his rooms, now reduced to 3 bedrooms on the top floor. She had developed an even more restricted routine. She woke up after the sunset, when she was sure she wouldn't find anyone through the corridors, fed the cats, I wrote letters, and spent hours contemplating photographs of his youth. The only images of herself could still bear. In 1945, with the end of the war, Blenheim was returned to the Churchill family. But the new Duke, John Spencer Churchill, nephew of her late husband, had no patience for the eccentric aunt. He wanted to modernize the palace, turn it into a tourist attraction, capitalize on the fame of Winston Churchill to attract American visitors. Gladys became an obstacle. His privacy demands conflicted with the plans to open the palace to the public. His cats destroyed old furniture and precious rugs. Its peculiar odor, a mixture of rancid perfume, feline urine, and medications, had impregnated the entire east wing of the palace. The tension culminated in 1953, when the new Duke informed her that she should leave Blenheim. At 72, after more than 3 decades, such as Lady of the Palace, Gladys Deacon was dumped from her own home. Gladys moved to a modest house in Chicombe, a rural village in Northamptonshire. The house had 6 bedrooms, a miniature palace compared to what most could allow themselves, but a monastic cell for someone used to Blenheim. She took with her only the essentials: 20, 3 cats, 6 chests of photographs, her most precious jewelry, and a single mirror, small, framed in silver, which she always kept covered with a black velvet cloth. Life in Chacombe has become a grotesque parody of its ducal existence. Gladys tried to maintain the same aristocratic, but without servants, without resources, without audience. She wore her couture dresses for dinner alone. He used diamond diadems to feed cats. I applied elaborate makeup even knowing that I would not see anyone for days. Local residents began to consider it a witch. She appeared on the streets of Chacombe, always with her face covered with heavy veils, whispering in French, buying food for cats with old notes that smelled the naphthane. Children ran as they saw her approach. Adults made the sign of the cross, but there were moments of frightening lucidity amid apparent madness. Gladys kept regular correspondence with French historians who researched Belle Époque. His letters, written in impeccable French, revealed a photographic memory about people and events of the previous century Parisian halls. She had become a living library of a dead era. In 1962, at the age of 81, Gladys had a domestic accident that finally forced her to hospitalization. One of her cats had knocked down a lit candle, causing a small fire she couldn't control alone. The firefighters who rescued it were shocked by what they found. A skeletal woman wearing a silk robe that had been magnificent a day, surrounded by dozens of hungry cats, amid piles of burnt photographs and jewelry scattered on the floor. The Northampton Psychiatric Hospital became the last address of Gladys Deacon. She was hospitalized as indigent patient, the final irony for someone who had already had one of Europe's greatest fortunes. His first months at the hospital were marked by a fierce resistance. She refused to eat, to take medicines, to participate in any social activity. It required to be called His Grace, and insisted that he had been kidnapped by political enemies. When nurses tried to bathe her, she screamed in French about the violation of her ducal dignity. But gradually, something extraordinary happened. Away from the mirrors, far from the photographs of his youth, far from any memory of his lost beauty, Gladys began to find a kind of peace. She stopped making up completely, let her hair grow gray and clutter. He used only the basic hospital uniforms, clothes without elegance, without pretense, without memory. And for the first time in decades, I could look straight at others without being ashamed. Gladys became a popular figure among other patients. She told Belle's stories with so much detail that she seemed to be reciting cinematic scripts. He talked about dances in Versailles, dinners with Russian royalty, summer afternoons in the French Riviera, when the world still believed in the eternity of luxury. Doctors initially considered these stories as symptoms of senile dementia, but when they checked the historical records, they found that every detail that Gladys narrated, from the menu served at a 1903 dinner to the color of the dresses worn by certain counselors, was absolutely accurate. It had become a living file of an extinct civilization. Gladys Deacon died on January 13, 1977, 96, at the Northampton Psychiatric Hospital. She had spent the last 15 years of her life without looking at a mirror. On the morning of his death, a nurse found her sitting on her bed, wearing the white hospital uniform, with her hands bent over her lap in a posture of ducal dignity. His eyes were open, fixed on something no one else could see. There were no signs of agony. She seemed to have simply decided to leave. There was no funeral. There were no obituaries in the big newspapers. The woman who had one day had been photographed by all European journals died in full anonymity. His body was cremated by the British state, and his ashes were scattered in an ordinary hospital garden without tombstone, unnamed with no date. Its few belongings were discarded by hospital staff. Among them, they found a small silver mirror, the same as it had covered for decades in Chacombe. When they removed the black velvet cloth that covered it, they found that the mirror was completely cracked, as if it had been broken inside over the years. On the verse of the mirror, recorded in French with its delicate handwriting, there was an inscription that no one knew how to translate completely. Just one sentence: La beauté is a crime that le paye toute sa vie. Beauty is a crime that pays for a lifetime. Gladys Deacon lived 96 years, but his true existence lasted only 20. The years between 1901 and 1921, when he was considered the most beautiful woman in Europe. Everything else was just a long descent to the shadows, a gradual process of disappearance that began at the exact moment when she tried to improve what nature had given her. Its story resonates today with a disturbing urgency. At a time when aesthetic surgery became common as a manicure, where digital filters redefine faces in real time, where artificial beauty is not only accepted but expected, Gladys Deacon remains a ghostly warning about the hidden costs of perfection. She understood, before any other woman of her generation, that appearance is power, but it also discovered too late that this power has expiration date, and that trying to artificially extend this period can transform the source of power into an instrument of destruction. The paraffin that Gladys injected into his face was only the physical manifestation of a deeper curse, the belief that female value lies entirely on the surface. She spent her life all sculpting as a work of art, just to find out that works of art, when exposed to time, inevitably deteriorate. Today, when visitors roam the salons of Blenheim Palace, they admire portraits of old duvets, women whose faces were forever preserved in paint and varnish. But they do not know that one of these women has spent the last decades of his life trying to essuspensi accept from own reflection. Gladys Deacon died as he had lived, alone in front of a mirror. But this time, finally, the mirror was broken. And perhaps, just perhaps, that was his first real victory against the tyranny of his own image. Beauty, after all, is the only prison we build for ourselves, and from which the keys are always outside.